Okay, let's get started. Today we're talking about encoding for adaptive streaming. I want to introduce you to adaptive streaming first, talk about how they work. Then we'll cover generic issues, how many streams should you use, what data rates should you choose for those streams. And then we'll talk about encoding for adaptive streaming. What do you have to do differently if you're producing for adaptive streaming than you would for single stream encoding? And then I want to talk about a technology called transmuxing that makes it very simple to produce for adaptive streaming if you're targeting two separate platforms. So if you're if you're targeting Flash and you're targeting iDevices, a transmuxing technology can take one stream and then convert it automatically to the other format to support that other platform. So we'll conclude there. Okay, as kind of a technology overview, adaptive bitrate technologies encode the source file into multiple streams, and then they deliver different bandwidths according to changing buffer requirements, the amount of data in the player, and also CPU utilization at the player. So you encode multiple streams, and then you deliver different streams based upon what's happening at the player side. There's two basic types of adaptive streaming technologies. One is a server-based technology, and the primary server-based technology now is RTMP Flash. And with the server-based technology, the server is in charge of delivering a different stream to the player. So there's a connection between the server and the player. Player says, buffer's running low, need a lower quality stream. The server sends that stream. With an HTTP-based system, which is HTTP Flash, HTTP live streaming, or HLS, which is the Apple system, the player monitors the same characteristics, but it's in charge of going to get a different stream when the circumstances dictate a stream change. And let's go into that a second. With RTMP Flash, if you're producing for RTMP distributed via the Flash system, you encode your H.264 files as normal. You just produce multiple files, 4 iterations, 5 iterations, but they're normal MP4 files. And then the server, as I said, switches as necessary at a keyframe. And if you're producing for an HTTP-based system, and this is an example of HTTP live streaming, you encode the file as normal, and then the file is chunked. So each file that you produce is broken out into 10 seconds chunks, say, or 5-second chunks. And then those files are sent to a server, an HTTP server for distribution. Alongside those files, the encoding tool creates what's called a manifest file. And the manifest file contains the locations of the alternate streams and the locations of the alternate chunks in those streams. And this is kind of what it looks like. So if I was, let's say I started out and I get the low 01.ts. That's we send a low quality stream. So the first chunk gets sent. And then the player says, well, the buffer's good and the CPU's good. Let's go to higher quality. The player checks the index file, sees the location of the next highest file, and retrieves this chunk here, and then starts to play that data. So the player's in charge. It's HTTP, so there is no streaming server. There is no continuous connection between the server and the player. And the player is in charge of retrieving the chunks from the alternate streams as necessary. RTMP Flash, server-based system, server serves the different streams. HTTP structure, same for HLS, HTTP live streaming, Silverlight streaming, smooth streaming, HLS, and HTTP Flash. You create the chunked files, you create the manifest files, and the player's in charge of retrieving them as necessary.
And it's just retrieving those chunks just like an image file or any other file.
That's correct. So there's no streaming server, and it's it's HTTP, so there's no firewall issues, and all that good stuff. I'm not going to go into that, but let me ask that you hold questions just so we get through. I've got 46 slides in 45 minutes, and I'm kind of wordy. So, okay, and this is so we just looked at the HTTP live streaming schema. This is HTTP Flash, and there will be a test on this. But I'm gonna simplify it for you. With HTTP Flash, it's the same thing. You start out with an MP4 file, you input it into the packager, you get your media file chunks, which are files with a .f4f extension, and you get your manifest files, which are files with a .f4m extension. Okay, so it's the same thing we saw with HLS. You input MP4 files in H.264 format, and then you end up with media file chunks and manifest files. And then the player, monitors changing conditions and retrieves the files as necessary. And this is what it looks like with smooth streaming. So you've got your manifest files, which are the ISM files, and you've got your chunked content files, which are the ISMB files. Okay, so that's how all the HTTP-based systems all work the same. There are minor differences, but they're manifest files and then data files. Okay, so I said, once we understand the technology that we're producing for, there's two basic issues. One is, how do we control the user experience? How many streams do we create? What data rates do we assign to those streams? And that's one side of it. And the other side of it is, how do we encode those streams? What do we do differently from single file streaming? So now we're going to go into the generic encoding issues. How many streams, what configurations, and what data rates? And this is, I'd love to be able to tell you strict answers, but there are no strict answers. I mean, it's kind of the wild, wild west out there. Everybody's doing it a little bit differently. But I'm going to show you the sources I went to reach the conclusions that I reached. I'm going to show you some examples of what people are doing. I'm going to show you what Adobe recommends, what Apple recommends, and that should be a good starting point for making decisions that meet your needs. So inputs for the analysis we're going to go through, multiple case studies, spoke to Harvard, Turner, MTV, NBC, Indiana University. And if you go to that reference, bit.ly.Ozer Adaptive, you can find the article that I wrote. So the article that I wrote turned into a chapter in this book. A little bit more work, but a lot of the basics we're going to talk about are on that article. And I'm going to talk about the other resources that I used, and it's something I've been consulting on more and more, so there's some real world input there as well. So choice one is how many streams do you need? And at a high level, you want relevant coverage. You want to produce enough streams so that every level that you're serving gets a decent quality iteration. If you're starting with SD, 3 to 4 streams is typically necessary. I've done some SD projects where we had 3 streams. They were all encoded at 640/480 because the video window didn't change, and we were done with it. I mean, it was pretty easy situation. On the other hand, MTV, they're starting out with HD source. Their high-end stream is 720p. Their low-end stream is, we're going to see in a second. So their low-end stream is 384 by 216. So they had a higher quality source, a bigger source, and they're distributing in multiple size windows. So what MTV does is they went out to all their properties and they said, what windows are we serving? What are the video window sizes? And they made sure to have one stream for each window size. So, if your websites have multiple size video windows, you want to have at least one stream for each window. The other cool thing that MTV does is they never switch streams unless the viewer goes to a larger window. So if you were poking along at this medium in page stream, 640 by 360, you're watching the video in the window, and if the buffer was fine and the CPU utilization was fine, MTV would not increase to a higher quality stream because their logic is, well, they're still watching in this 640 by 360 window. Why send a bigger file just to scale it down for that window? If they don't switch windows, we're not going to switch streams. So what do I take away from MTV? If you have multiple size video windows, have a stream for each. Include in your switching logic no switching to a higher quality stream until people actually switch video windows. Okay, still on the subject of how many streams do we want to use. Major League Baseball, last time I checked, they had 11 streams. That was I think a year ago. They may have gone up. They're a subscription-based service, premium content. People are paying. They want more. So obviously, if you're charging for your content, you need to have more streams and better serve your client. If it's entertainment, MTV was 8. Turner Broadcasting, on the other hand, with the PGA Golf Tournament, did 4 streams. So just because you're entertainment doesn't mean you need to do 11 streams. And then typically you saw fewer on the education or corporate side. The University of Indiana had 3 streams, Harvard had 5 streams. So as I kind of started out, there are no hard and fast rules. Fewer streams necessary for SD files because you're not going that big resolution. I think you need more for entertainment because entertainment's about the experience. I think if you're serving adaptive streaming for business purposes, you're just trying to make sure that every viewer can watch the video. You're not trying to provide this premium entertainment-oriented experience. And then again, if you're charging for it, you probably need to provide better quality of service at all levels because people are paying. They're not getting it for free. Couple of other rules: never encode it larger than source. We could have taken the 640, 480 source material I talked about before and scaled that up to 720p, but that doesn't improve the experience. So if you start with SD, don't scale up to get to an HD file. Who here knows what Mod 16 is? Mod 16 is kind of the compression rule that says always have a height and width that's divisible by 16. It is the most efficient way to distribute H.264 video, but it's kind of irrelevant at the larger resolutions. Really important at 240, 180, irrelevant at 1080p, and it's very much ignored now by most video producers. Most video producers, most encoding tools won't encode to an odd resolution, 321 by 183. They won't do that. You see most producers in the Mod 8 or Mod 4, but Mod 16 is kind of not something that's followed any longer. Again, if you've got adaptive video in a single window that's not going to change based upon the data rate, I've gotten pretty good results having a single resolution and then changing the frame rate and the data rate to get the adaptive streams. Obviously, if you have different window sizes, you're going to want a video stream to serve both of those or all of those. And kind of following along my previous comment, if you end up with a very, very low data rate, and we'll see this with some of the Apple recommendations. If you want to stream at 300 kilobits per second, and you've got a 640, 480 window, you could create a 320 by 240 video stream and then scale that up, or you could create a 640 by 480 video resolution file and then encode that at 15 frames per second. And that's something that I've seen a lot of people do, and that's what I've done with several consulting projects. It seems to work better at the lower data rates to lower the frame rate rather than to scale the video down just to scale it back up when you're going to display it. So that's something you can try when you're configuring and working with your own set of streams. Okay, so HTTP live streaming, we all care about this. This is the only way to reach Apple devices with adaptive streams. If you go to the URL on the slide, you'll see Apple's recommendations for stream configurations. Okay, so if you're producing a stream configuration for distribution to Apple devices, this is where you want to start. And this is, these are the resolutions and data rates that we're recommending. A couple of points here. We'll get back to this. Looks like the keyframe interval is changing, but this file is encoded at 10 frames per second, so it's a keyframe every 3 frames. This file is encoded at 15 frames per second, so it's a keyframe every 3 frames. And these files are encoded at 30 frames per second, so it's a keyframe every 3 frames. So one of the things we're going to talk about is you want keyframes at identical points in all files in the adaptive stream. The other thing we're going to talk about is if you look at the data rates here, this is 110 and this is 150 total, 110 video data rate. The audio data rate here is 40. Okay, and if you go to the top quality stream, 4.54 megabits per second, 4.5 megabits per second, the audio stream is still 40 kilobits per second. So Apple is recommending not changing the audio streams when you're producing your adaptive streams. That is the most conservative approach. It eliminates any kind of audio artifacting with the change of streams. The obvious problem is if you've got premium audio content, the people who are getting a 4.5 megabit per second stream don't get the benefit of that. So again, that's a decision you need to make, but obviously Apple's recommendations are don't change the audio stream. We're going to talk about what profiles are in a minute. It's interesting. Apple is basically saying change the profile according to the target device. Okay, so they're saying use the baseline profile for all these devices that can only play the baseline profile, but when you're encoding a stream that's targeted for higher-end devices like the iPhone 4, the iPad 1 and 2, shift to the main profile. And the manifest file that Apple creates is smart enough, and the player is smart enough, not to try and retrieve a stream that they can't play. So you can mix profiles in a set of adaptive streaming files, because devices that can only play baseline files won't try and retrieve a file that's encoded with the main profile. Okay, so that was Apple. This is a very detailed Adobe white paper, and Adobe kind of takes what MTV is talking about and takes it one step further, and it's a pretty good logical step. They're saying, it doesn't make sense to have one stream at every window size. It makes sense to have at least one or two streams at every window size, because that way we can switch streams within the window size. So they recommend choosing window sizes and then clustering within those particular window sizes. And you see what I mean. Here's one size. We've got 2 streams. Another size, 4 streams. Not quite sure what they're doing here, but 3 streams here and 2 streams here. So if I was picking streams, I'd have one for each window size, and then for the most common window sizes, I might have 1 or 2 or 3 alternatives in that window size. That's the Adobe recommendation. Okay, this is not something I expect you to memorize, but it's in the presentation, so you can refer to it when you want. This is Microsoft's recommendations for smooth streaming, what they did for the Olympics, what they do for Sunday Night Football, the presets in Expression Encoder. So I would look at all of these if I was trying to produce an entertainment-oriented smooth streaming experience. Who's going to be doing smooth streaming? Okay, well this is a good resource for you. I'm gonna list other resources at the end of the presentation on smooth streaming configurations. And this is, if you go to the Adobe Media Encoder, these are the recommendations that they make in their presets. So if you look at all the presets in the Adobe Media Encoder, you'll see they've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 streams. They've got some clustering going on, and like Apple, they are customizing the profile of the video for the devices that they're targeting. Okay, so we know we've got a good idea how we're going to choose the resolutions. What data rates should we implement? Rule number 1 is they must be sufficiently far apart to avoid constant switching. I mean, you wouldn't have streams that were 50 kilobits per second apart. You wouldn't have streams that were 150 kilobits per second apart, because then you'd have too frequent stream switching. It degrades the experience, and it puts a lot of stress on the system as a whole. And then if we look at what MTV has done, they've got 350 kilobits between their lowest stream and their next highest stream, and then 450, 500, 500, and 1.3 megabits per second. So you start at a reasonable distance, and as your streams get larger, you just obviously have larger gaps between the streams. Okay, this is a cool tool. I think it's worth knowing about. Particularly useful in terms of choosing the data rate. So this is the smooth streaming calculator. This was produced by a Microsoft guy named Alex Zambelli, who's actually here at the show. And what you do here is you put in the maximum width, the maximum height, frame rate, aspect ratio. You can either force mod 16 or not. Then you put your minimum data rate, your maximum data rate. Let's try 5400. And say we wanted 10 levels. And then you click go, and he comes up with suggestions for bit rate and resolution. Okay, so it's interesting. If you've got 11 streams here, you're seeing 134 here, 180 there, 240 difference there. So I might look and say, well, goodness, we really don't need this stream here. Let's go to 10 streams because these are so close, the experience isn't going to change all that much. And we can probably just do without that stream. So that's kind of the analysis I do, is you come up with a number, you space out the data rates, maybe using this tool, maybe not using this tool, and then you look at like, well, how far apart are they? Does that really generate a completely different experience for the viewer? Do we need to have that? Fewer streams are always better because it's just less complication, less storage, less encoding. So I would eliminate streams that were too close to each other, and that's what I've recommended in a lot of my consulting projects. I mean, if you're 150 or 200 kilobits per second apart, might not be worth doing. This is a cool starting point, though. Okay, so now we know the stream count, the resolution, and the data rate. What do we do differently when encoding for adaptive as opposed to encoding for single file streaming? Okay? It's very important to realize that irrespective of the technology that you use, you're going to want consistent keyframes in each file. Okay? And the general rule is you're probably going to want shorter keyframe durations when you're producing for adaptive streaming because stream switches occur on a keyframe. So if you have a keyframe interval of 10 seconds, you can't switch streams for 10 seconds. And in some scenarios, that's a lifetime. So for single file streaming, you don't have that issue. I recommend keyframes in the 10-second, 300-frame time frame. For keyframe interval with adaptive streaming, the interval is going to be shorter, typically between 2 and 5 seconds. Now, we talked about chunked technologies before. All the HTTP technologies use chunk technologies. Your keyframe duration has to divide evenly into your chunk duration. So let me just, this is Sorensen Squeeze. They came out with a new version. I had the beta. I don't have the final version yet. They do something. They have a really cool interface for adaptive streaming. And this is not it. So adaptive bitrate streaming. So what they do is you put the keyframe interval here for every file that you're going to create. These are the resolutions and the data rates of the individual files that you're going to create. And then you can add and subtract these as you want. And you can customize these from an H.264 perspective as you want. So if you wanted these to be main profile, you can customize that on an individual basis. But you set the keyframe interval for all files and the chunk size, or the fragment duration they call it for all files, with controls here. You also set the audio for all files at one point. Okay? So this is kind of a cool schema for making the point that you want keyframes at the same location in all files. Typically, you want to disable scene change detection because you want regular keyframe intervals, right? You don't want to. Scene change detection is a wonderful technology for improving quality at scene changes, but you want regular keyframes when you're streaming adaptively because they have to be in the same place and they have to be regular. Okay, kind of a review. Keyframe interval has to divide evenly into the fragment duration or chunk size. So if you have 9-second chunks, use a keyframe interval of 3 or 9 or 1. And then keyframe interval has to be at the same location in all streams. Okay, here's kind of a fun issue. Generally, when you're streaming to broadband clients, you prefer to use VBR, variable bitrate encoding, where the data rate varies with scene complexity. You prefer to use that because you get a higher quality experience. On the other hand, the variability in the variable bitrate stream can cause problems in an adaptive scenario because it can introduce stream changes that relate more to the way you encoded the file than to changing conditions. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. So here's some client work I did. We were producing streams, coming up with encoding parameters. And on the left, we see a file that was encoded using constant bitrate encoding. So we see a pretty consistent data rate in this file. Okay? On the other hand, in this one particular frame, we see it's really, really ugly because it's a frame after a camera switch, and it's a pretty high motion frame, or it's right after a high motion frame. This is the same file encoded with variable bitrate encoding, and that frame looks, crystal clear. And we see the data rate moving up and down in this file because it was encoded with variable techniques. So variable techniques give us higher quality, but they also can cause problems with adaptive streaming because, here's the scenario. You start out, you've got 3 chunks of data with a file that was encoded using VBR. This is a normal size chunk, this is a big chunk, this is a small chunk. When you send the normal size chunk, it gets there in plenty of time. The buffer status is okay. The buffer is still a pretty high level, so the player thinks, well, gosh, everything's going well. But then you get to the large chunk, and it just takes longer for that chunk to get there because there's so much more data, right? So then the buffer, the player says, oh my goodness, the buffer's gone down really low. We have to switch streams. And so we have a stream switch potentially triggered not by a change in conditions, but by how we encoded the file. And that's the negative of VBR encoding. Positive is quality, negative is it can cause too much stream fluctuations. What are people really doing? MTV uses VBR encoding. They use 2x constrained VBR encoding for their video streams. I was pretty cavalier with my consulting. I said, well, gosh, this is what all the real-world customers are doing. And then when it came down to it and we had to make the system work, it was like, well, let's start with CBR. Because it's safer, it's more stable, it's going to cause fewer scene change or stream changes. So that is the conservative approach. If you're just starting out, that's what I would recommend. On the other hand, it's not, most people who are doing this, I don't want to say most, a lot of people who are doing this, including MTV, are using VBR. And then in general, audio parameters, the same thing. We saw what Apple recommended. Apple used 40 kilobit per second audio in all the streams from 200 kilobits per second to 4.5 megabits per second. The problem is that if you do change audio streams, sometimes you can hear popping when you change the streams. The negative of using one approach, obviously it's going to have to be a low data rate approach, is that if you have a premium audio experience, you don't deliver that at the higher bit rates. So it's just something you need to be aware of. You're gonna try this, you're gonna test it, then you need to just listen and see what happens when you encode your own files and stream switch. Most of the people who are doing this, they're switching from mono to stereo using the same per channel sampling rate and the same bit rate. So start out at 64 kilobits per second mono, 44 kilohertz 16-bit, and then switch to stereo using the same parameters. And that may reduce any artifacting that you would encounter. Again, this is, if you look at what MTV is doing, they are producing at higher audio quality levels at the higher streams. They want to deliver the premium audio experience to their customers. Okay, in terms of H.264 encoding parameters, primarily the profile and level, we saw Apple change from the baseline profile to the main profile. We saw that Adobe did the same thing. And obviously, if you're creating one stream that's going to serve multiple targets, we're going to talk about transmuxing in a second. You need to serve the lowest common denominator. The lowest power device that's going to retrieve that stream is the one that you have to configure for. So if you're creating one stream that's going to go to computers but also go to old iPhones, you've got to use the baseline profile because that's what the old iPhones support. And then in terms of web-based adaptive streaming, WebM-based adaptive streaming, there's some proprietary approaches that are out there. There's an HTML5 standard coming in a technology called Dash. Microsoft is one of the heavy promoters of that. Unclear at this point what Adobe's going to do. Unclear at this point what Apple's going to do. Obviously, no standard. If Apple doesn't support the standard, then it's probably not going to come true because everybody wants to support iDevices. That everybody wants one desktop player, usually Flash, sometimes Silverlight, and everybody wants iDevices. And if Apple doesn't join the spec, then it's hard to see it really going that far. Okay, so 2 years ago when I spoke to Turner Broadcasting about how they produced the PGA Championship, they said they produced a Flash stream and an iDevice stream, and they did it with two separate banks of encoders. So they had one encoding rack set up for iDevices and one encoding rack set up for Flash. And then I spoke to them the next year, and they said, we used Akamai, we encoded for Flash, and then they took that stream, which was encoded in H.264 format, and then they transmuxed it. So they didn't re-encode it. They changed the container format from the MP4 format to the MPEG-2 transport stream that's necessary for Apple, and they created the manifest files. And they did that all in real time. So they went from two sets of encoders to one set of encoder. Akamai did this. They call this in-the-network conversion. And I think Wowza was the first company to do it. And you can send Wowza any of the streams listed on the left, and they can, again, transmux. They're not re-encoding. What they're doing is rewrapping the file to serve Flash, Silverlight, QuickTime, iDevices, and IPTV. So most live streaming service providers, a lot of them use the Wowza technology, but this is something that you absolutely need to have if you're starting out and saying, I want to do adaptive and I want to serve multiple targets. The other thing that's common, and this is a new feature of the Wowza encoder, it's also available in a technology called Sorensen Squeeze Live. And what Wowza can do now at the server is they can take a single H.264 file in, and then they can not only transmux it, but they can re-encode it. So the benefit is we're here in a hotel. This is a great discussion. We want to broadcast it to the world. We want to serve streams all the way up to 5.4 megabits per second, and all the way. So we want to send multiple streams. Maybe the total is 20 megabits per second. We can't do that. We don't have enough bandwidth. So what we could do with the Wowza transcoder is we could send one high-quality stream, and then they could re-encode the streams. Again, that's different from transmuxing. They're actually re-encoding, and then they can create an adaptive experience that they can then transmux to multiple targets. So anybody who's ever produced a live event knows that outbound bandwidth is a terrible problem, and this is one potential solution for getting around that. Okay, here's resources, RTMP, and this, again, download the PDF file and they're there. We've got some for RTMP, some for HTTP Flash, some for HLS, some for Silverlight, and my book. Okay, so we're good on questions. Anybody have any questions?
So one thing I'm not really familiar with is, so you say you want to transcode into, whatever kind of format you want to transcode into. Say you've edited, say you're not maybe streaming, but you've created a piece of media in Adobe Premiere Pro CS5, and you want to get that into all of the multiple bit rate. I understand that Adobe Media Encoder is not the best one. So do you then from Premiere create a really high quality file that you then bring into Sorensen Squeeze or whatever, or is there some way to kind of get it in there directly?
So what's the best workflow from Premiere to Squeeze? Are you on the Mac or Windows?
Windows.
Okay. I mean, if you're on the Mac, I would export from Premiere in ProRes, but you're not on if you're not on, you may not have Final Cut Pro on that system anyway. I don't think there is any direct way. I'd have to, actually there may be. Email me, because let's just, I'm not sure where they are with this, and I'm not, but let's, if I can find a video file. So here's, now we're exporting, and I believe with the shipping version, you might have the ability to access Sorensen Squeeze here. I've only got the beta version, so I think there may be the ability to do that. I think it's limited in that it can only be presets that are not custom presets. But email me and I'll get an answer to that one.
Thanks.
Hi, you mentioned both Wowza and Akamai for transcoding and transmuxing live streaming. Do you have a recommendation for one over the other?
Okay, let me mention a couple things. Number one, they're two completely different things. So Akamai is a service that you hire, and Wowza is a server that you buy or lease. And the other thing I wanted to add was, it's not only Wowza at this point, it's also Adobe can do this with Flash Media Server 4.5. Microsoft's IIS can do this. Real Networks, what's the name for their server? Say it again? Yeah, the Helix server can do it, and there's one other that I'm forgetting. So there's a bunch of servers out there that can do it. And then Akamai, again, is a service. And in terms of recommendations, Turner had great things to say about Akamai. Akamai is an expensive premium solution. The people I was working with, the one video we saw, they were using Flash Media Server in the Amazon cloud. So I think you just, there's so many different variables you'd want to, is it available in the cloud? Do you want to buy it? Do you want to lease it? All that stuff. And those you'll have to go through that to make the decision.
Along the same veins of this transmuxing, would it be, thank you. Oh, wow. Along the same veins of this questioning about the transmuxing, would it be conceivable or cost-conscious to set up a Wowza transmuxing server and just pass files to it for transmuxing purposes only, and then streaming through an Edge Origin FMS 4.5 configuration, or?
When you say, you mean Flash Media Server 4.5?
Yes.
Well, Flash Media Server can now transmux as well. So Flash Media Server 4.5 can take in a flash stream and transmux to iOS devices, live and on demand, creating manifest files in the packetized format. So you wouldn't need Wowza in that particular application.
Well, my concern is burdening on the servers. If you're doing the transmuxing to multiple data types for production servers versus...
Yeah, you'd have to talk to Wowza about the, how many streams they think it can handle. But transmuxing, I think, is not a big server load. Re-encoding, that transcoding we talked about, that is a pretty big server. They have very specific limits on what they can handle there. But transmuxing is not a challenging task. Oh.
Given the ambiguity of Microsoft and the future of live streaming, do you have any suggestions on hedging your bets regarding the future of that if you're currently using Silverlight?
But I will say you're the second person who asked me that. So that's obviously there's a lot of concern in the community.
Was the first person on Microsoft first?
Good one. I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to tell you. What I told the other person was it wouldn't hurt to have a Flash trial project. Flash Media Server not only does transmuxing, it does multicasting, and it does peer-to-peer, so it's getting very enterprise friendly. And I think it would be smart for everybody who's on the Windows platform to at least understand how that could work in their environment.
How does captioning currently survive the transmuxing process? What's the state there?
Good question. I don't know.
You mentioned yesterday You mentioned yesterday about using the correct sound rate for if you're using binaural microphones and the like. In the chart up there, it was showing set rates that were fairly high. What percentage are we talking about in data of, let's say, between a 300-bit file that's going out that's made up of sound versus a large? I mean, how much is this affecting the amount of data you're sending over?
All the data rates that we've listed up there in the individual slides those were video only for the most part. So none of that was. And then, typically you very rarely see data under 64 kilobits, and you very rarely see audio data over 128 kilobits per second. So, that 64 kilobit per second swing can be pretty important if you're in the 300 to 400 kilobit per second video range. On the other hand, if you're at 3 megabits a second, it's very low differential.
Just on the transcoding front, you mentioned Sorensen Live and I think Wowza, and I know Coolabyte has a solution there. Is there any other solutions that you're aware of, the cloud live transcoding?
Yeah, I think the Coolabyte solution is, I don't know if that's their exclusive product existence, but that's the Squeeze Live solution. It was a joint project between Coolabyte and Sorensen. Sorensen, or Coolabyte, as you probably know, just got bought by Heyvision, and that was after Squeeze Live was announced. So I don't really know what their plans are. I mean, Coolabyte's a wonderful technology. I know they've got it in the cloud. It's very efficient. It's very high quality. So, I don't know what kind of agreement Sorensen has, if there's any exclusivity in it, but I would explore that as well.
That's just those. Really, then there's just two.
Pardon?
Now, there's really just two.
There's just two I'm aware of. Yeah, I mean, this is relatively new. I mean, Squeeze came out with this maybe 4 months ago, so you don't see a lot out there.
You're right, though. It's such a huge issue at venues, and bandwidth is so expensive at venues.
It's such a pain to.
Talking about digital rights management, I know it's kind of in a transition area now, but do you have any experience with DRM as it pertains to adaptive streaming?
It's a real problem. The one client I work with who was concerned about DRM went out with flash only, and I think they did RTMP, and didn't worry about iOS devices. So I think there are some cross. It's one of the things I need to get smarter on at this show, but it's not. It's, as you say, it's in flux.
Anyone?
So investigating this multicast is a real problem because the new protocols aren't supporting it and the older ones do, except for Flash. So where have you found smooth streaming and HLS where it's going to go into multicast support?
I think there are ways to make smooth streaming multicast compatible. I think you have to use a third-party technology, as I remember. I don't think there's any native approaches. Apple does not. I don't think they have anything. And Adobe just introduced it with 4.5, which is, has not been shipping that long at this point. I think it's going to be a really. I think the enterprise is going to get a lot more attention over the next few years, and I think Flash Media Server is a good example of that. 4.5. Terrible answer, but that's all I got.
Or just to follow up on the DRM thing. So things like the HBO Go and Netflix, etc., because those are within an app, those are all adaptive streaming. Is the DRM then built within the app, or any insight, any idea?
I think
doing to protect their
I think
content?
DRM is pretty simple within one platform. I think it gets really much more complex when you're trying to do multiple platforms. So if all you're trying to do is Flash, there are technologies that can do it. Once you add iOS, it's added complexity. If you look at over-the-top boxes, if you look at every platform is very scattered at this point, and it's very challenging to just serve them all. And DRM is not a strength of mine, so there may be solutions out there, but I'm just not real smart in that.
We have time for one more question. That's it. All right. I think you're free, Jan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.